Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second half of our Christology module. So we'll be finishing module 2 today. And last time we had a great presentation on the Christology of Hebrews. There was a section in my planned lecture on the Christology of the writer of Hebrews, where Jesus is presented as an eternal high priest making an eternal offering in the eternal temple. We might not get to that, and it'll be okay. I thought what our presenters did was really, really well presented. We talked about how Bauckham read Psalm 8 as both the descent and ascent of the Son of Man, so that in Psalm 8, even though a pious Jew, a contemporary of Jesus' day, would have read it like many of us would have preached on it, that this is a psalm that extols humankind's special place in the order of creation, even though we don't deserve it. Why, when we look at the finger, when we look at the works of your fingers, the moon, stars that you set in place, what is man that you're mindful of? The Son of Man. And I particularly chose that translation that you care for him, because the Son of Man here is referring to all of humanity. It's what is man, humanity, and what is Son of Man, their descendants, that you would actually care for them. The whole psalm seems to be a celebration of God's special favor on humankind, even though we don't deserve it. But then we saw the writer of Hebrews read Psalm 8 Christologically, that the Son of Man is a reference to Christ, who calls himself the Son of Man. And this is about Jesus' incarnation and resurrection. So we talked about that. We also talked about the early Christology, that Psalm 8 is not the only text where the New Testament sees the story of Jesus prefigured and anticipating the Christ event in the sacred texts of Israel. We had Psalm 110, where the Son of God sits at God's right hand. We also had the Psalm 2 text, where on the coronation of the Davidic Messiah or King, God says to the coronated King, "Today I have become your father and you are my son." And David's messianic descendant enjoys a special relationship with God that's different from the rest of Israel. God treats him as a son would a father would a son, and that the nature of that relationship gets expanded. So we hear how these texts were read in their Old Testament context, and then we see how the New Testament writers from these texts see the anticipation of what unfolds in Jesus' life, where they bear witness to both the life of Jesus, his death, and his resurrection. That scripture had always anticipated the Christ event. It's just that they needed the Easter Sunday to look back and see that story unfold in the sacred texts of Israel. So this is where we are right now, and we're gonna just a couple of quick administrative announcements. So just a friendly reminder that I should send a post out or official announcement, but I'm now extending the time for the quiz so that it opens up on Thursday, and you have until Friday night, 11:59 p.m. That's a regular practice. So that's going to happen every week, because the Wednesday recording people listen to it at different times. So if they listen to it at Wednesday evening, then it doesn't give them much time to prepare for the quiz if it's done on Thursday. So regularly, the quiz will be due on Friday evening, and it'll open up on Thursday. And tonight we have a different schedule. So as I shared last week, Josh Jipp from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, the author of your reading for this evening, is going to come and join us at 8 o'clock. And I have a set of questions for him. I'm going to be asking him what is New Testament theology, and why he wrote the book in answer to that question. I'm going to ask him how does the New Testament revise or reconfigure or connect. I'll leave it up to him to describe the process. Jesus as Israel's Messiah, with our understanding of him sharing the Godhead of God. What we try to do up until our time together was say that these two are separate threads, and that just because we claim Jesus is the Messiah, the son of David, that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel is anticipating that the same person would share the Godhead of God. So how does the New Testament bridge together these two threads that converge together in the person of Jesus, so that Jesus is Israel's Messiah, and he's also he's the Son of God. He shares the Godhead of God. So he's going to go through that with the New Testament, with a special focus on Paul, the Gospels, and Revelation. He might even go touch on Hebrews. And what I want to do is just kind of quote Josh Jipp, explain the significance of this book. Can I point it up here? It's going to be blurry. Okay, I guess if I put it on my face, then you can see it. The Messianic Theology of the New Testament. I want to read this quote, and then this is going to be my preview or lead into our presenters. So we're going to just jump in right away. Our goal is to try to finish around 7:50. So the presenters will present and we'll have a discussion, and I'll make some comments. 10-minute break. Josh Jipp comes at 8. He's here from 8 to 9 or longer. I told him that if he needs to go at 9 o'clock, definitely just to have him as an hour would be a gift. But if he lingers a little bit longer, that's okay. So I'll have some set questions, and the questions will open up to the class. Anything that you want to ask him about what you heard him share or about what you read. But I want to begin with the significance of why he wrote his book. While I readily affirm that the New Testament authors also draw upon priestly, prophetic, and other images to construct their Christology, it seems to me that Jesus' messianic identity deserves pride of place in terms of an organizing center of his life and mission. This is important because while it might come to a surprise to you that this is not a given, of course, Jesus is the Messiah. In historical Jesus studies, there are competing portraits of how to anchor Jesus's life, mission, identity. And just a guess, out of Messiah, king, priest, or prophet, what do you think is the dominant paradigm, at least right now? Any guesses? Volunteer?
Prophet.
Prophet, very good. Why? Does somehow it was instinctual, or I mean, we do think that not only is a major religion, Islam, considered Jesus a prophet of God, but Jesus, when we read the Gospels, the people, and remember, Jesus doesn't quite affirm it. The people begin to think he's a prophet of God. And so some historical Jesus portraits, and the most famous one is probably N.T. Wright, who does see Jesus as God's Messiah, but nevertheless, he understands much of what Jesus does as a particularly prophetic act, prophetic ministry. So what Josh Jipp has done is, while one could center Jesus's identity, life, and mission around prophet or priest, he has swung the pendulum back, and he has argued strongly that that Jesus' self-understanding as the Messiah of Israel anchors everything about who he is and what he's doing. And while this might seem obvious to us, it's a point to be argued in scholarship because this certain status quo, and that's why it's quite significant. So because many, for example, Jesus' miracles look like prophetic acts, and messiahs don't do miracles. So how do you explain that? You know, we don't typically think of the Davidic king doing miracles. So, but we do think of prophets like Elijah and Elisha doing miracles. So that this is where the discussion has kind of been debated. And Josh Jipp's wonderful book kind of swings the pendulum back to the identity of Jesus as primarily the Messiah of Israel. And with that, I'm going to now step out. We're going to do module 2, and Amy and Ollie are representing also Aubrey and Lauren, who couldn't be here today, but I had nevertheless done the work to help prepare their presentation on Josh Jipp and Martin Hingel's work on the Son of God. So let me stop the sharing. And now, oh, great. And almost immediately, very good job. What a seamless transition. I am impressed. And I'm going to now hand over the microphone to our presenters. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about Christology in the Gospels, Paul, and Revelation. And we analyzed Martin Hengel's article and Jipp article. In my part, I'm going to discuss Martin Hangel's article, and I'm going to attach some basic elements in his article here. And he's, as you know, as you read through, he's discussing some basic elements regarding sonship language, like the Son of Man, Son of God, Messiah, and they're sitting at the right hand of the God. And his main argument here is that, like, he has two critical passages from the Old Testament. The first one is Psalm 910, and in there we see that the theme is sitting at the right hand of the God. The Son of Man is sitting at the right hand of the God. And in the second passage, Daniel 7, we see that the Son of Man is coming from clouds, and he's making judgments, and he's sharing the divinity of God together. And Martin Hangel's argument here is that the Son of Man, one like human, who is enthroned in Daniel 7 and Psalm 110, is indeed the Son of God, which means the Son of Man is the Son of God in these two passages. And this is not just an easy assumption for him, because he's giving us some source background from, for example, from Qumran community. He notes that in Qumran community, people believe that Michael was the Son of Man, the Prince of Light. But later in the rabbinic literature, we see that there are some messianic interpretation of the Son of Man, which is making some connection between the Messiah and with the Son of Man. So his main point here is that Jesus is in authority alongside with God, and this is his main thesis. And I'm gonna read. The one like human in the Septuagint version of the judgment scene almost takes the place of God. His authority thus becomes identical to authority of God, and his dominion identical to God's dominion. The sitting at the right hand in Psalm 110:1 means similarly transference of divine authority and judgment. At the same time, it is the most intimate relation of one who is chosen by God with God himself. So his main point here is that Jesus in authority alongside with God. And he's making some connections in the New Testament. And we see that he says in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew confirms the Son of Man is the Son of God. And Mark 14:62 is confirmed that Son of Man is the Son of God. But only in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, Luke omits the Son of Man. Luke omits Jesus as the Son of Man. But later, we have Acts 7:55, and we see that there Acts confirm that Stephen saws the glory of God, and he sees that Jesus is standing at the right hand of God. So Acts 7:55 confirms that Jesus, where he should be, he is standing at the right hand of God, and the Son of Man is the Jesus, and he's sitting at the right hand of God. And Hangel makes pretty good emphasis on similitudes of first Enoch, and he sees the similitudes of first Enoch as the bridge between Son of Man and the Son of God. So for example, in Psalm 110 in Daniel 7, we see the Son of Man concept, but later in the Gospels, we see that the Son of Man is becoming the Son of God. And according to Hangel, this is the first Enoch is the bridge between these two concepts. And according to Hangel, there is an eschatological unity between the Son and between the God the Son and God the Father, according to these passages. One important thing, when it comes to strengths and weakness, we see that Hangel makes strong connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and he is making clear role of the one like a human, judge, dominion, and divine authority. And most important thing here is he's implying that there is an eschatological unity between the Father and the Son. And when it comes to minus side, we see that the bridge between sonship language and the Son being enthroned could be more clearer. He's not defining who is the Son of Man, or who is the Son of God, and who is the Messiah, he's not defining these concepts in clarity. So he's using them in more abstract concept, I assume. And he's making overemphasis on the first similitudes of first Enoch. Maybe it would be better he just mentions this and not making overemphasis on the similitudes of first Enoch. And when it comes to theological and pastoral implications, we see that Jesus is God, and that changes everything. And theological implications are the Trinitarian belief and the divinity of Christ. Like, if Son of Man is the Son of God, this means there's a Trinitarian belief. Jesus is God, and Jesus shares the divinity of God. And Jesus is not just a human, and he's not just a nice human, he's also shares the power and strength and divinity of God. And when it comes to pastoral implications, this means that there is a power in Christ, and Jesus is powerful. And this is a helpful reminder and comforting reminder for those who are powerless and overlooked. This means Jesus is powerful for his powerless believers, powerless communion, powerless people. And when it comes to divinity, and another pastoral implication here is the divinity of Christ. This implies that Jesus is not just a human, he is also a divine, he is also a God, he is also, he's not just a nice God in the New Testament that we like more than the mean God of the Old Testament. He's just as much the eternal, powerful, mysterious creator God, God the Father and God the Son. So he's not just a human, he is also divine when it comes to pastoral and theological implications. So my part ends here. I turn mic to Amy.
Thanks, Ali. The second article is, of course, Christology, the Messianic Identity of Invocation of Jesus. It's a chapter in Josh Jipp's book that Dr. Lee showed us earlier. He has really two main goals with this article. His first thesis is simply that the New Testament texts are unified in their portrayal of the identity and activities of Jesus as Messiah. And he does this, next slide, by looking at the sort of thread, the six activities, if you will, from birth all the way to reign. And we don't really have time to look at all of these, but I thought I would just pull out some of his specifics from the two bookends. So we'll first look at birth, the incarnation and birth. So next slide. And he looks in the Gospels and in some Pauline work, and also in Revelation. So in the Gospels, the descriptions of Jesus are really interwoven with descriptors of Jesus's messianic identity and the typological narratives that allude to the important events from the history of Israel, marking Jesus as messianic king. In Romans, we see that Paul demonstrates how God's faithfulness to his promises ties into the promises made to David and David's descendants. So Paul describes Jesus as in form of God. And then in Revelation, we see the reflection of Psalm 2:9 in speaking of the woman, or Israel, giving birth to a male child, the Messiah, with the messianic power to rule the nations. And this sort of standout quote that he uses kind of, I think, portrays this particular place in the birth and incarnation, and that is that Paul's reference to Jesus, previous slide, Paul's reference to Jesus as God's son should not be understood as anything other than his creative articulation of Jesus's messianic identity. So he's very clear about that. As we move then into the bookend, the royal reign over all the nations. So next slide, we can just go on. We see in the Gospels the Magi who worship the Christ, Jesus's commission of his disciples to teach all the nations. And we also see Luke declaring that Jesus is the salvation for all peoples, or a light of revelation to the nations. Paul, just in Acts 15, James appeals to the book of Amos to make sure that the Gentiles are included with God's people. And in Revelation, we see that there's the demonstration of the universal kingship of Jesus when he's called Lord over lords and King over kings. So we see that messianic mission would be for all the nations, not just simply for Israel, that God's kingship is universal there. And then moving on to the second, I'm going to move quickly here, but his sort of second goal is represented in this second thesis: Jewish messianism and the conviction that Jesus was the singular anointed messianic king played a necessary and critical role in the early Christian worship of Jesus, and the belief that he was uniquely related to the God of Israel. And this is what Dr. Lee was talking about at the beginning, really alluding to that very connectedness that we don't even think about needing to be a big deal. But Jipp notes that it has become very clear over the past several decades that worship of Jesus and belief of him as the divine occurred during Jewish monotheism, and not just as some sort of evolutionary historical occurrence. He does break with Bachman's argument for a strict divide between Yahweh's divine identity in three really particular ways. The personal relationship between Christ and the God of Israel, there's not a strict divide there, as Bachman would say. God's freedom and ability to share his identity and functions with those he elects. Jipp really emphasizes this, and Jipp also emphasizes the role of Israelite royal ideology and Jewish messianism in the origins of New Testament Christology. Next slide. And so this idea that God is not who God is as a father without Jesus, and Jesus is not who he is as a raised and exalted one without God. So rather than speak of sort of divine identity and Christ as identified with the God of Israel, the biblical texts support a Christology of divine persons. The God of Israel, Jesus the Son, are who they are only in relation to one another. So they're connected there. God defines himself as a distinct person in such a way that the relation is internal to the self-definition. And so we kind of have this emphasis on the relationship there that really helps us to understand that belief that Jesus was uniquely related to the God of Israel. If we're looking at strengths and weaknesses, just some, Dr. Jipp is just really strong in that survey of New Testament texts. Man, the beginning of each one of those activities of Jesus is really heavy with references to the New Testament texts, and it's really helpful to see that creative look at Jewish messianism as well as that point of origin. Also really appreciated that this is a discussion. It does not feel like some didactic, pushing of a view, but just a really encompassing discussion of the particular points that he's trying to bring out. I would have liked to see the chapter expanded to flesh out the second claim a little bit more thoroughly. That would have been really helpful to me. And so if there is a weakness in the article, I would just like to have had more of that. So I think if we're looking at just sort of those theological implications or those pastoral implications, how this would really work, theologically, simply, Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus shares God's throne. We focus on the wholeness of his messiahship, not just the Easter story, but the entirety of the text, and the fact that Jesus also deserves all honor and worship the same as God the Father. And then just pastorally, it's really important to read the text as a whole, just to gain a full understanding of the Bible. The Jewish understanding of who the Messiah would be was critical to the early Christian church. And this should remind us today to read the Bible as a whole, and to understand the context in which it was written and how it can apply. And then also just the fact that God's kingship is universal, that we are part of a messianic mission. And that's pretty important, I think, looking forward. We just threw some discussion questions together. If they're useful or helpful, we can just leave them here, or we can get rid of them as Dr. Lee would prefer. We just have, what are some misconceptions about Christ in your area of ministry or peer group? How does Christ's identity as fully human shape your view of your own humanity? How does Christ's identity as fully divine shape your view of his life and teaching? It's just some things maybe more pastorally also to think on. And that is where we will end in our speed read of our two articles.
I'm going to switch screens and get back to my screen. Thank you. Very well done. I think you handled a complex topic and gave as thorough and concise a review of the reading as you could. So I commend you on what you've done. It was really well done. Let me see if I'm making sure I'm getting the right screen. Okay. I think what we're going to do is, for the sake of time, because I'm conscious that Josh is going to join us soon. I want you to respond to some questions as we go through, and I'm going to highlight some of the points that you covered, but maybe we can go a little bit in depth, and then this might prepare us well to discuss things with Jipp. I really do like your weakness critique, that we really want Professor Jipp to kind of flesh out a little bit more how the personal relationship between the Messiah and God, the God of Israel, is the basis in which Jesus can be identified with God. I think that is both brilliant but understated in the chapter, and I really want him to flesh it out. Now, what I want to do then is I'm going to move forward, and I want to spell out more thoroughly what Ali rightly pointed out in his presentation, that Hinkel's whole contribution that really began a flurry of studies on early Christology is the connection between the Son of Man and the Son of God. It's almost, it's hard to say if Hinkel came up with the idea first, or simultaneously Hinkel and Se-Yoon Kim, who also wrote a book called The Son of Man as the Son of God, because the book was written in Tübingen, where Hinkel was teaching, that their discussion with one another on the topic bore two separate works. So to me, it's really exciting that when scholars collaborate together, that they come up with, not competing, but collaborating projects on Christology. So I'm going to point us out. Since the critique was, he did a lot of work with First Enoch, but we really would like to see what's going on in Scripture. We're going to focus on the gospel text. But what I wanted to do is mention that the reason why First Enoch is given such attention is because Hengel wanted to say that the identification of the Son of God as the Son of Man, or Son of Man as the Son of God, didn't happen in a vacuum, that other Jewish contemporaries were also thinking about it, maybe not in the same way as the Gospels identify this with Jesus, but nevertheless, they were wondering who this Son of Man in Daniel was. And was he just a image of resurrected Israel? So like Psalm 8, what is man that you're mindful of, the Son of Man that you care for him? Maybe the Son of Man is not an individual person, but represents all of Israel. It's a corporate entity. So there's all sorts of speculations, but what we have in the First Enoch text is the identity of the Son of Man as a person, but a divine person. So when Enoch goes to heaven, who does he see in God's heavenly entourage? Someone that shares God's glory, to the point where, is this a divine person? And then Qumran, as Ali mentioned, that maybe this is Michael, because whatever this person is, he can't be a human being. That's the idea. So remember that the Daniel translation, when you read the article, it doesn't say Son of Man. That's actually the title that Jesus kind of epitomizes or gives a paraphrase of. Jesus paraphrases the Son of Man, because in Hebrew, and I mean in Aramaic, it is one like the Son of Man, not the Son of Man. Jesus paraphrases that as the Son of Man. So what's going on here? Because whoever this glorious person is in Daniel 7, he must be a divine figure. We can't figure out who this person is. He looks like a human being. He's one like the Son of Man, but the glory that he shares with God clearly kind of points to that something beyond a human origin. So Israel was confused about who this person is, and if it is a corporate personality, represents all of Israel, it can only be at the resurrection, where Israel, as the elect ones of God, are resurrected and somehow share God's glory and co-rule with God, with them as human beings, but glorified. And so they're no longer like the regular human beings of the dust of the earth. God has glorified them at the resurrection, but there's nevertheless still human beings, maybe without sin, maybe without the domination of a broken and fallen world, but nevertheless, it would be corporate Israel at the resurrection. So the Daniel 7 figure is a mystery, an enigma, an exegetical puzzle for Israel. That's the key thing. And what Jesus does is he solves the puzzle for them. So at his trial, so in Mark 14, you get Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin. And I purposely color-coded the text. Anything that's related to the Son of God is separate from language of the Son of Man. The Son of Man is in the orange and the Son of God is in the yellow. These are not the same people. In Israel's mind, they were always separate and different. Hingles says that the New Testament contribution is that they saw both combined, that Jesus as the Son of Man was the Son of God. They're one and the same person in Jesus. And that's the unique New Testament claim. That's the beginning part of Christology. So so at the trial, the high priest asks Jesus, confronts them. Okay, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the Blessed One? And the Blessed One referring is God. I mean, this is circumlocution. They're trying to not say God's name. So are you the Messiah, the Son of God? That's what they're asking. Jesus says, I am. And had he stopped there, the trial would have continued. Because just because you claim you're God's Messiah, that's not necessarily blasphemous. Remember that they're trying to get Jesus to say something like, did you claim that you destroyed the temple? They're trying to get Jesus to blaspheme so they can execute him. So just being God's Messiah, even though they don't believe he is, and they might think he's a fake one, doesn't give you the charge of blasphemy. But Jesus continues, doesn't stop there. And he says, not only am I the Son of God, Israel's Messiah, David's son, but you will see the Son of Man, different title. And then seated at the right hand of power, going back to the Psalm 1 Son of God text, and then coming with the clouds of heaven. The part that belongs to Daniel 7 is just this part. You will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. That's Daniel 7. Everything else, the Messiah, the Son of God, seating at the right hand, that's the Psalm 110 text. You have two different texts combining together. And so let me jump ahead. This is just a reminder that in Daniel 7, this resurrection scene where the Ancient of Days God, and there's thrones around him, and there was one like the Son of Man, all right, and one that looks like a human being, but not a human being. Maybe a human being? No, who is he? He's coming with the clouds of heaven, and he's given God's authority and glory and power and worship and everlasting. But notice, not one verse says he sits at God's right hand. He can't, because if you sit at the right hand of someone, you have the exact same authority and power of that person. You cannot have two divine people in the Godhead sharing the exact same authority. All of a sudden, monotheism seems to be threatened. So is he God's representative? Is he Israel resurrected because there's thrones? Golden Gay says in your textbook, the vision's explanation indicates that the more senior figure, the Ancient of Days, stands for God, while the ordinary figure, the one like the Son of Man, stands for God's holy ones, perhaps for Israel itself at the resurrection. Hingel says the one like a human comes to the clouds of heaven, brought before the Ancient Days, does not appear as judge, but rather as a victorious party in a suit. He is exalted in honor. In other words, at the day of judgment, God will vindicate Israel. The Son of Man is pronounced right, in the right, over, and all the nations of the world are wrong. And missing in Daniel, however, was the motif of enthronement, the title Lord. For the one like a human, nowhere in Aramaic is it said that he takes place at the right hand of Ancient of Days. Perhaps he's a personification of the martyrs or the true people of God at the resurrection. Does everyone see that historically these are two separate figures? So what happens then is that, and I already talked about, I'm gonna combine the two, and then we're gonna look at another text besides Enoch, and then we're gonna field some questions. But so here's the Son of Man text. Here's the Son of God text. And what you'll see is that Jesus combines them in a way that gets him killed at his trial. What is blasphemy? If the Son of Man in Daniel was like a human being, but perhaps a divine figure, and you have texts in First Enoch that say that the Jewish people speculated about this, but they never thought that he would be the Son of God, because it's okay if you have a human being, the Son of David, as God's viceroy. Remember that word? A representative of David, a representative of God's earthly rule, but nevertheless a human being. So he's giving God's authority as God's viceroy, as God's right-hand man, literal, being literal there. But because he's a human being, the Godhead's not threatened. But if that same person is now the Son of Man, who in some circles is considered a divine person, then you have the Godhead threatened. The boundaries of monotheism are bursting at the seams without being busted. You have one divine figure, the Son of Man. He's also the Son of God. Therefore, he sits at the right hand of the Ancient of Days, the God of Israel. You have two divine persons, each with the full authority of God himself, and they share this, and they're sharing the throne of leadership, or one throne is next to the right hand of the other, and therefore two divine persons, one God. And you had the beginning of binitarianism, or the beginning of the sharing the Godhead with Jesus of Nazareth, and eventually the third person, the Spirit of the Lord, or the Spirit of the risen Jesus. He is also going to be part of this, of the sharing the Godhead. And then you have a Trinitarian, but the beginning parts of early Christology, according to Richard Bauckham, is binitarianism. That the first question the church had to answer was, how does Jesus of Nazareth share the Godhead of God? And so this was a scandalous claim because it was rejected by the rabbis. So I'm going to read this text really quickly. So Rabbi Kiva is the first century. Rabbi Yosef is later. They don't live in the same time period, but they're debating one another. That's what Jewish Midrash does. And so Rabbi Kiva says, till thrones were placed, what is there to say? One throne for him, being God, the other throne for David. Ooh, so Rabbi Kiva speculated, could the Son of Man actually be David? Even as it is taught, one was for him and one's for David, the words of Rabbi Akiva. Then Rabbi Yosef said to Akiva, how long will you profane the Shekinah? This is blasphemy. You can't say that. Rather, one throne is for justice, the other for mercy. What's happening here is that Rabbi Yosef knows the implications of this. You cannot say that the son of Daniel, which might be a divine person, is also the son of David, because then he would sit at God's right hand, and you would have two divine people having the exact same authority of God. This is threatening to monotheism. We've always claimed that God is one. And so this can't be. Instead, he reads it metaphorically or figurative or allegorically. Actually, one throne, the Ancient of Days, must stand for justice, and the Son of Man must stand for mercy. I mean, so he reads the allegory to diffuse the scandal that if David is, in fact, the son of David is also the Son of Man in Daniel 7, then monotheism somehow is being reconfigured. But that's exactly what Jesus claims at his trial. That's what gets him charged blasphemy. That's what gets him killed. Now, here's the punchline. Hingel is right. What in Acts chapter 7, all right, what I want to share is that what Jesus claimed at the trial is what Stephen actually saw. Stephen actually saw what Jesus claimed to be. So did Paul. That's what happened on the Damascus Road. So in Acts 7, Stephen, who's about to be martyred, says, and filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed in heaven. And what did he see? He saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand. So he sees the Son of God at the right hand. But look how he identifies them. I see heavens open and I see the Son of Man. Jesus is the Danielic Son of Man. He is the eschatological judge of all nations. And he's standing at the right hand of God. Stephen actually saw what Jesus said he was. And so did Paul, because without going into a lot of detail, if you read the Pauline letters, and when Paul references his own autobiographical experience, his own Damascus Road experience, he adds a further detail. He says that not only did he see the glory of Christ, but he saw that when he saw the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the throne of God, he saw that he was the perfect image. He was the exact mirror of God in his glory. They were. In fact, if you look at the glory of God, you'll see that this is found in the face of Jesus Christ himself. So what a lot of scholars, and this is coming from Se-Yoon Kim's book, The Origin of Paul's Gospel. I'm rushing through this, but I'm just going to give you this snapshot form. Some scholars have argued that when Paul talks about the glory of Christ in the image of God, that is a reference to his own Damascus Road experience. And he uses that as a teaching moment to talk about who the Christology of Jesus to the Corinthians and whoever, or any other letter, like especially Romans and Corinthians and Philippians. And so Paul saw the glory or doxa of God in the face of Jesus on Damascus Road. He saw the same thing that Stephen saw. In Acts, it's not explicitly stated, it's inferred that whatever Stephen saw, Saul the Pharisee also saw, but it's confirmed when Paul talks about it in his own letters. And so when we look at the early Christology, the Daniel Son of Man was probably considered to be a corporate personality for most of Judaism. Some speculated, like First Enoch, that it might be an individual divine person, but no one said that was David, because they knew the implications of the claim. If it's a divine person, then he can't be the Son of God, because you can't have divine persons share the exact same authority. He could be Michael, like an angel. He can be, a figure that represents the resurrected saints, so shares in God's glory, but he can't be his own individual divine person. But Jesus claims that at his trial, and Stephen saw that at his stoning. And Paul claims autobiographically in his letters, not only did that he saw the same thing that Stephen saw, but he saw something more, that whatever the glory of God is, it is perfectly mirrored in Jesus. He's the perfect image. And part of what it means to be a Christian then is to be conformed to the image of God's Son, that in his humanity, Jesus shows us what it means to be made in the image of God. But Jesus also shares a unique image of God in glory that only he shares as a divine person. And so that's it. And we have time now. I'm gonna stop here. And just say that what Josh Jipp is doing is a different trajectory. So, and I'm not necessarily saying that it's wrong. I mean, you can have a New Testament Christology that takes more than one trajectory, that whatever happened on Easter Sunday was anticipated by Scripture, but we just simply read Scripture wrongly or with a veiled lens, as Paul says. Paul says that Moses, to read it through the covenant of Moses, is to read the Old Testament with the veil on our face. We can't see the glory when the veil is there. So the veil had to be lifted on Easter Sunday, and the church went back to look at Israel's scriptures, and they saw, aha, while we never expected the Messiah of Israel to share the Godhead of God, Scripture did. And here's where we see it. And so I've taken kind of the Balcom route, to be honest. Amy has rightly noted that Josh wants to take a different route, which I'm intrigued by. And I think they don't have to be competing, but they can be mutually collaborating, because with the Christologies, you just have such a rich kaleidoscope of different ways that the New Testament writers reflected on the identity of Jesus, that we don't have to see these as necessary competing threads. So I'm really interested in the idea that somehow the personal relationship, the uniquely personal relationship of the Messiah as the Son of God, informs how the Messiah also shares the Godhead of God. I can see that happening. I kind of think I know what he wants to say, but I'm going to let him say it directly. Instead, I want to open it up now for questions. We have about 5 minutes before a 10-minute break, and I want everyone to come back by 8 o'clock so that we can jump into our guest time. And I might direct the questions to Amy and Ollie. So questions? We went through it, but I'm actually quite amazed we did this before. We did this really well on time. It's because the presentations were done well. So I just piggybacked off it. So thank you.
Max, can you just quickly reiterate the difference between Bockham's view and Jipp? Can you synthesize that?
Yeah, well, I think, why don't you ask that of Josh Jipp? I think that's better. Because I know what Bockham's thinking. I'm a little bit hesitant to put words in Josh Jipp's mouth and then find out that I'm wrong when he talks to you guys. But I think what Bockham is doing is that, and I've kind of been trained, is to always think that the category divine person and Jesus the Messiah are separate threads, and they are combined in the person of Jesus, but they have their history is separate. I think that what Josh is doing is he's not necessarily having two separate threads. He's just following one thread, the messianic thread, but there's enough there in the messianic thread to talk in the arena of the unique relationship between the Messiah and the God of Israel, including sharing in God's divine identity. That's one thread that leads us to the identity of Jesus as God. And rather than what I shared was, I think what Jesus was doing was combining two different, combining figures that weren't combined before. Like the suffering servant wasn't supposed to be identified with, it's a non-messianic text in my opinion. The suffering servant was someone else in Israel's theological landscape. But Jesus said that no, the Messiah is the suffering servant, and the Messiah is also the Son of Man of Daniel. And that means you have a convergence of separate histories or threads on a title, and they're combined in the person of Jesus. Whereas I think what Josh is trying to say is that you just need to follow the messianic thread and you can get to Jesus sharing the Godhead of God. And yes, these other threads contribute to that. And we, in many ways, we also need them. And not only that, but the image of Jesus as the eternal high priest or as God's prophet, that also contributes to the Christology of the New Testament. But the core is going to be Jesus' messianic identity. And he wanted to demonstrate that with that one core, you can get to Jesus sharing the Godhead of God without necessarily relying on the other threads. Does that help, Michael? Was it Michael that asked the question? Okay, so I think that's what's going to say, but leave room that I might have misread him and therefore he'll say something different. Other questions?
I had just one kind of comment, maybe a pastoral question for you, Max.
Okay.
I think it's really interesting to go back and think about Jewish monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes when we read the text, everyone comes with presuppositions and then puts it within their own context a lot of times, right? We just sort of naturally do that as human beings. And so I know Dr. Edwards in New Testament 1 alluded to this too, like the Pharisees get a really bad rap. Like there's just so many folks we misunderstand in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, what do you think are some of the preaching implications or teaching implications of, and that's a large, I recognize that's a big question, but.
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. I want to throw it out to the group, and I want to begin with our presenters. So Amy and Ollie, can you chime in on that first? And then I think we'll have to continue that question, maybe even after we hear Josh Jipp. So It's a great question. I mean, and that's where we want to land. We were doing all this work to land where you're asking. So, but can I ask Amy and Ollie to chime in a little bit before our break?
I mean, honestly, I struggled with this because I tried to decide if I was just being theologically or academically lazy, or if I felt like this actually did not matter from a pastoral perspective, and maybe did not matter is too strong. But I think that's why we landed, at least for Jipp, the Jipp article, we landed on those like pastoral implications as being reading the text as a whole, like noticing the strong thread throughout, and the coherence of the New Testament text surrounding whether or not Jesus is Messiah and whether or not Jesus is Son of God and God, like that all the New Testament texts are very clear on this. So pastorally, I thought, it's just strengthening or reiterating the position that we land on, that Christ is Messiah, Christ is Son of God, Christ is God, like that. Those things are just really strong.
I think there's real implications to just what you just said. Christ is Messiah, Christ is Son of God. And I would add Christ is Lord. He's not my buddy. He's not my, when we say he's our friend, the friend of God is very specific in the biblical corpus. Not everyone was God's friend. Abraham was God's friend. Moses was God's friend. They're friends because they did God's will, and God felt like they were not only so obedient to God's will, God confided in them when he said, should I just wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah? And Abraham talked him out of it. Or should I wipe out the nation of Israel after the golden calf incident? And I'll restart the nation with just your bloodline, Moses. And Moses said, don't do that. So we cheaply talk about the friend of God. That we're God's friend. We cheaply call Jesus our brother. I think we need to really understand that Jesus is our king, and yet he treats us as brother and sister. Jesus is Lord, and he treats us as part of God's family. But we should never, but being a brother of the Lord or a child of God doesn't override the fact that because Jesus shares the Godhead of God, Creator has the domain to rule over creation. He does it in a servant way, and he models it through the cross and resurrection. But nevertheless, sometimes we treat God as if we can negotiate obedience, for example. And we can, because God is patient with us, but nevertheless, it's not the proper, it's not, I won't say proper, but we're not letting God be God when we kind of negotiate our obedience with him, for example. So maybe that's one pastoral implication, that we have to remind ourselves who God is and how that person is witnessed to in the fullest form in the person of Jesus. Now, I saw a hand, but we're going to take a break. So why don't we do this? I think it'd be good to have Josh come in and then settle in a little bit. So everyone come in like 8:03, so we can start at 8:05 exactly. 8:03 and start in 10 minutes or so. Okay, we're on break. Please come back. Okay, we have everyone back. It's okay, 8:03, so people are 2 more minutes. So those of you dropping in, we have Josh Jipp coming live from an office that's right next to his son's bedroom at home. Josh and I, just as an anecdotal note, got to spend a year as Henry Fellows at the Trinity Evangelical Divinity campus. I took a sabbatical leave for a year. We worked on our separate book projects, but I and Josh and Alex Stewart in Old Testament and Kevin Kinghorn in Christian philosophy from Ashbury. We were the 4 fellows, and we worked together. It was a great time. Miss it already. We met, we worked, we had coffee breaks. We even had a bake off between Josh Jipp's chocolate chip cookies and another staff member at the Henry Center. And then how did it go? Did they go for mats? Chips over yours? I can't remember.
I think it ended up being a tie, but what
tie?
nobody knew was that my homemade cookies were from Costco out of a box. So
Okay. So
yeah, I felt bad when people were voting for me.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
the homemade cookies. Yeah.
I think Matt went all out and did everything from scratch. So
yeah,
but still, they were good. It was a nice treat. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to start. Let me introduce Josh Jipp, who's the author of the chapter you read in his book, Messianic Theology of the New Testament, as well as that short little chapter in his companion book, the Cascade Companion book on Acts, on the God who acts. Josh Jipp is associate professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He was, as I shared just now, as people were coming in, a senior resident Henry Fellow for 2020-2021 year, working on a project on I would say Paul and human flourishing as the art of life. And I hope I'm not butchering your project. Yeah. He graduated his PhD from Emory, and quite enviably, his dissertation supervisor was Luke Timothy Johnson, which is a major figure in New Testament studies. One of my favorite books of his is Saved by Faith and Hospitality. Yeah, which is also kind of partially a tree branch off of his dissertation on Acts, and I think the Malta scene in Acts. So he is a brilliant scholar, and at the same time committed to equipping pastors and leaders in the church. He's very pastoral, as well as I think has a theological depth that can really help inform people in their struggles in ministry. His students love him. There's so many. So I met some of them and talked with them, and they all really appreciate Professor Jipp and the time they spent with him. I'm thrilled to consider him a colleague and friend. I'm very grateful that he can share our time with us. So maybe with your mics off, can we clap and just kind of welcome him to our class? All right, so I'm going to mute myself soon, but what I wanted to do was simply ask a couple of questions, and then we'll have an open Q&A. And the first question I want to ask is, how do you envision New Testament theology, Professor Jipp? And how did that vision lead you into writing something like the Messianic Theology of the New Testament? Can you share a bit?
All right, thanks, Max. Thanks for the nice introduction. I miss seeing you all. I miss seeing you. Like it was fun to be able to see you every day almost last year, and all of the pranks that I was able to play on you, even you giving me that kind introduction. I thought maybe you would be trolling me, and I'd come here and there would be nobody here, and it would be your prank getting me back.
No. Then I wouldn't get you when I really wanted you to come and preach and teach. So no. But he did play pranks. I'm not good at that, so I think I let him make fun of me. But then every now and then I could do a zinger back. But
yeah,
not,
you did.
Very few and frequent.
No, well, yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks. It's nice to meet all of you. I hope at some point maybe we get to meet face to face or chat a little bit more individually. So the introduction to the book, or maybe it's the foreword, I say something like, I remember being assigned to teach this class, New Testament Theology, where I teach at TEDS, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. And I remember kind of thinking, like, this class must have been assigned to me because nobody else wants to teach it. What is the project? Like, why I knew what it was. I'd had classes on this in my master's and PhD program before, but I kind of felt as though, I don't know if this is really a live discipline. It's not as though, God said, at some point, thou shalt do New Testament theology as, central to the academic discipline of New Testament studies or for the life of the church. It really kind of has a particular history, and I don't know what you've all looked at, but in some ways it has a particular history that came out of asking questions, a variety of different questions. So there's no one way to do New Testament theology, but some of those questions were basically, why read these 27 books together? Like what is there some sort of like, Matthew's different from John. The pastoral epistles are different than the Corinthian correspondence, right? James is different than Romans, Revelation, right? So there's plenty of diversity, right, in terms of the depictions of Christ, or maybe their views on the law, or what discipleship looks like, or how Gentiles get included in the people of God. So there's plenty of diversity, but what's the unity? Like, why should these 27 texts be read together? And then I would say also in the past, there have been questions that another question that's stood behind New Testament theology is, can one give a reading of these 27 texts that's not like entirely reductionistic and just boils it down to something really meek and meager, but can one give a reading of these 27 texts in such a way that it's marshaled for either a strong theological argument, either for the life of the church, either to address humanity wherever it happens to be in society? So these are some of the questions, I guess, that were often asked by New Testament theology. I said I would never write one. I was not interested in one, in part because most New Testament theologies, in my view, often were sort of, there just wasn't a lot of energy or interest behind them. They weren't often creative or interesting or doing what I thought like had been interesting about New Testament theology in the 1900s and early 20th century, and often ended up just being sort of chapters on different books of the Bible that maybe were helpful, but sort of would be like a glorified introduction to the New Testament that I might use to help me teach intro to the Bible or a Sunday school class, but really wasn't like within the realm of New Testament theology. So why did I end up writing this book? It basically came down to a lot of my research started to focus more on the centrality of Jesus' messianic identity. I started with a book on Paul where I argued that the language of Christos, meaning Messiah, Christ, Messianic King, was, in my view, one of, if not the sort of central confession that Paul worked with, and then sort of unpacked his gospel and his theology. As I was working on that book, I started to have questions about, well, this seems to be in its own way central to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Revelation, Hebrews, James, and yet they're all starting with a similar, it seemed to me, like one similar confession: Jesus is the Christ. But then they're like unpacking that in their own sort of unique, creative ways. And so there was an element here, going back to the unity and diversity question. It seemed to me that one might be able to read the New Testament texts as all sort of a creative articulation or expansion upon Jesus is the Messiah. For Matthew, Jesus is the Messiah, and you see that in terms of how he starts with the birth narrative. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, the city of David. There's all these different texts from Isaiah and Micah and 2 Samuel that are quoted to invoke him fulfilling these Davidic messianic promises. He's the Davidic messianic shepherd. But then, just to take another example, right, for Revelation, right, he is also the Messiah, the Lion, the tribe of Judah, exalted at God's right hand, the one who fulfills Psalm 2 and will rule over the nations. So I won't go through all these different texts, but I was looking at them and saying, like, each one of them, again, this is unity, thinks of Jesus as the Messiah, as sort of the central building block of what they're going to expand upon, but they all do it in their surprising, unique, and creative ways. So that's the unity and diversity motif. I wanted to try to see if I could read these 27 texts, all oriented around basically Jesus' messianic identity as the central content of New Testament theology, and show their diversity by looking at the ways in which they do, they look at Christology, soteriology, so on and so forth, different in their own unique or creative ways. And then I guess the second part of the book, which is actually the, where the chapter you read on Christology, I wanted to try to also see if I could write to basically show how our dogmatic categories or systematic theological categories of scripture, salvation, Christology, ecclesiology, politics, to see if I could look at how those dogmatic categories are also indebted to, or in part outworkings of Jesus' messianic identity. And basically try to some extent, marshal a theological argument with respect to those doctrines that would, maybe in some small way, be life-giving or nourishing for the church as it sort of renews or reminds us, the church in the 21st century, that we are subjects of the risen Christ, and what sort of a theological life or theological way of life in service to his kingship might look like. So maybe that's a little bit of a long answer, Max, but that was that's what I was trying to do in terms of write a New Testament theology. It really didn't start with, I want to write a New Testament theology. It started with, I think Jesus is the Christos, is really a unifying thread throughout the New Testament. And I want to try to see if I can tease that out. So yeah, that's that.
Great. No, I mean, I think great projects often begin with burning questions, and you obviously had one, how Jesus is Christ is kind of unfolded and articulated in its diversity, yet it has one New Testament message. That's the best of what New Testament theology should do. So really appreciated your work. I enjoyed reading your book, and I read not all of it, but parts of it. I'm still reading, but definitely I appreciated the diversity. I think you brought that out really clearly in your individual chapters, but the class did focus on your synthesizing of the diversity. Yep. So that, but yep. What I think we can ask some questions right now before we go on to the next question I want to ask Josh. So any quick questions from the group? You can ask some fun ones you like. Quick questions. I'm wondering what book surprised you the most? Was there something about Jesus, the articulation of Jesus' messianic identity from a particular canonical author that you said, "Oh, I just that this is quite surprising," but it engaged your attention perhaps because of that?
Yeah, I can give a handful, but I can give at least two that come to the top of my mind. I think the first one surprise maybe was Hebrews. So if you're like me and you think of Hebrews and you think, what's the central image for Jesus in the book of Hebrews? You're probably thinking he's the high priest, right? The hill priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And I do think that is the dominant image, Christological image that Hebrews uses. But I think one of the things that was interesting for me was that the author of Hebrews, in order to make his case that Hebrews, that Jesus is the Melchizedekian high priest, is he basically has to remind his readers, right? He's already the Davidic Messiah, right? We agree if in Psalm 110:1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool of your feet. Right, this is how Hebrews 1 actually starts. Right, so that's Psalm 110:1. We agree. We already confess. Right, we're not surprised by. It's part of our basic confession. Right, that Psalm 2 has said, "I will establish my king, my anointed king, at my right hand, who will reign over Zion." And so the first chapter basically lays out all these Davidic messianic images. Psalm 110:1, Psalm 2, 2 Samuel 7, right? But then basically the uniqueness or the surprise that the author makes, in my view, is basically saying, well, if Psalm 110:1 is true, and we agree with that, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool for your feet, then reading 3 more verses down, you are a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, must be also true of the one that we already confess to be the Davidic Messiah. So hopefully that makes sense. But basically my understanding in Hebrews, it was in order for the author to get to the confession that Jesus is the Melchizedekian high priest, he basically builds that on top of Jesus' Davidic messianic identity, something that I think his audience would have already shared. Maybe a second surprise to me would just be, I don't know, maybe the book of Revelation and the way in which Revelation uses images of Christ's kingship, but in a paradoxical way to subvert the normal powers and kingdoms of the world. So the way in which, right, Jesus is, you remember in chapter 5 where in chapter 4, John sees into, he has the trip into the throne room, and he's weeping because no one is able to, to open the scroll. And the angel tells him, don't weep, right? The lion from the tribe of Judah has conquered. And he's bringing together really like kind of warlike images from Genesis 49, Numbers 24, and Isaiah 11 that maybe on their own, if they weren't mediated through the life of Jesus, would just kind of conjure up images of kingship, war, power, military might. But then, of course, right, John like opens his eyes, and whether he opens his eyes, I don't know. The language is behold, see, right? He sees, right, the lamb that's been slain on the throne. And so the image of kingship then is still one of power, but it's an image of kingship and power that gets sort of reworked through the life of Jesus as the sacrificial and slain lamb. And then the way that image goes throughout the book of Revelation, so that basically the lion lamb has his own followers that are like his army that follow him, and they do conquer and they do fight, but the way that they fight is by following the lamb, and it's entirely one of basically nonviolent resistance, giving testimony to the Messiah. They conquer by the blood of the Lamb. And so the army that's following Jesus, following their messianic kings, has a really active role, but the role is not one of violence or fighting. It's rather power that's being mediated through testimony and witness to the Lamb. So all these images of kingship, of war, of a military battle, of holy war, right? They're all there in Revelation. And I think, but they're being, so strongly reworked through a crucified Messiah. That's maybe something I had seen before, but when I was working on the chapter, I think I was a little bit more surprised in terms of how significant the theme of basically holy war, military war, but being subverted through the lens of Jesus was for the book. So those are at least a couple of examples that I was surprised by.
That's great, because the class last week we went through Hebrews, and we were also marveling how the emphasis on the sonship of Christ was a predominant theme. But then we had this Psalm 110. If you just read a few verses down the line, all of a sudden the Melchizedek text comes up, and for us, as we're discussing it, we're thinking of how through Baucham's article he was saying that the Christology began with sonship, but then what do you do about the second half of Psalm 110? And the writer of Hebrews was one of the unique ones who actually took the second part and developed it further. So I'm not quite sure if this is the right way to put it, but I felt like Hebrews was Christologically entrepreneuring, and it's because of the Christology. But it began with the Psalm text, and then Revelation, I think, and then in other parts of the canon, whatever kingship Jesus exercises, unlike the kingships of the world, different ways to fight, different way. What our weapons are different.
I think actually not just Revelation, but I was constantly struck by. I think that obviously, it's easy to like pull out Romans 13 and First Timothy 2, and those texts are there and they're in our canon. We need to read them and give good interpretations of them, in my view. But I was definitely overwhelmed by how critical these New Testament texts are with respect to the human kingdoms of the world, and the way in which, whether it's the Messiah. I mean, almost I'll just be giving a lecture on this if I don't stop myself, but almost every different New Testament text is portraying the messianic reign of Jesus in a way that exposes the fraudulent kingships of the rulers of the earth. So I will just give one example. I love this passage where it's like, so Mark 6, it's the only episode where Jesus is basically not the major character, and it's the story of John the Baptist's beheading. So basically, right, you're brought into Herod the Tetrarch's inner court, and basically the depiction of his kingship is one where he is, right, sexually can't control his desires and passions. He's emotionally unstable. He's like he's thrown back and forth, and other people, right, he's being manipulated, right, by Herodias and his daughter. He puts to death a righteous person. He then has this grotesque, John the Baptist, this grotesque scene where the head of the John the Baptist, right, comes in, right, on a platter, right? Well, the very next scene then is basically a depiction of Jesus' messianic kingship, right? Where he is basically the Ezekiel 34 messianic shepherd, right? That sees the scattered flock of God's people, right? And nourishes them and feeds them, right? They're two different feasts. They're two different kingships, right? And the one kingship of Jesus, right, basically exposes the counterfeit, fraudulent nature of the kingdoms of the earth that mimic what true kingship is. So I guess, yeah, I was struck not only in Revelation, but that was Mark 6, right? But through a variety of different New Testament texts that are making similar kinds of points. So
yeah, I mean, in the miracle, I think referring to the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark, I mean, it is a vision or a preview of the messianic banquet in many ways too. So I never thought of contrasting the feast of Herod with what was happening with the feeding of the 5,000, but that's a great contrast, actually.
Yeah, because they're right next to each other. Mark brings them right next to each other. I won't go through all the different echoes and parallels between, but yeah.
Great. Maybe you can help the class out, because our class has been kind of wrestling with this in our entire time on Christology. And so we have Jesus the Messiah, thoroughly argued for in your book and convincing. And then at the second half of your Christology chapter, and it might be that this is addressed more thoroughly elsewhere. So please forgive us for just kind of focusing on this one chapter. But you move, as one student said, into describing how Jesus's unique relationship as the Son of God, as Israel's Messiah, is the basis for understanding his sharing the Godhead of God, his divine identity. And we all wanted that fleshed out a little bit more than what you articulated chapter. And Amy, since you asked that question, did I get that right? Did you want it articulated a different way, or I'm putting you on the spot? But
no, that's fine. I think I just wanted more. It felt like there was lots of things were touched on, and then there just wasn't enough time to go, really explore those, particularly like the break you took with Bauckham and the just really kind of fleshing that a little more. I wanted more of that. There was so heavy on the first part that I just kind of wanted more on the second part. Yeah.
So would you mind answering the question? So given that Jesus' foremost identity is as Israel's Messiah, how do we then transition theologically or in terms of reception history or historically into the idea that he's also a divine person and God shares his divine nature with him by virtue of his missing identity?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Amy and Max too. I don't, and I think I'm not embarrassed by it, but I'm also like, I think I totally agree with you. I think it could be fleshed out more. I think it's not fleshed out more in part because I don't know if you can fully get from Jesus as the Christ to the full inclusion within the Godhead, within the unique divine identity. I think, so I think like part of the reason maybe where it's not sort of like a fleshed out, fully orbed kind of argument that Bauckham and Hurtado and others are trying to give, because they're not limiting themselves to Jesus' messiahship in part, but is in part because I'm not sure. I think it's one important aspect of the historical story of trying to explain how is it that Jesus as the Son of God and God the Father were viewed basically as two persons, obviously Holy Spirit too, as included within the divine identity. I think for me, what what I was trying to do is basically say, though, just this: if you are a Bacchum or a Hurtado, or and what I mean by that is you're trying to give a exegetical and historical explanation of the rise of belief in Jesus Christ as divine, that you can't do it apart from examining the way in which in the Old Testament scriptures God frequently spoke of the Messiah or the King or the Son of God as one that he elected and anointed to share in his reign and in his rule. So, for example, in first, in the book of Chronicles, you have the king basically as one who God exalts and lifts up. He gives his glory to. The people of Israel even bow down and they give worship to him. How is that appropriate? Well, at least within that context, it's only appropriate because God himself, in his transcendence and in his freedom, right, chose, right, and had designated the king to be one that he shared his glory with. Variety of other Old Testament texts, right, that would be similar in terms of like, how is God going to act, right? God is going to come back in the prophet Ezekiel, right? At times it speaks of God is going to come back on his own. And at times he says, right, I'm going to come back and it's going to be through the Davidic shepherd. So throughout the Old Testament, basically, I think what I'm trying to say is you simply have, right, two different figures. They're not just blended or melded together as if they're an amalgam that's, Jesus is identified as Yahweh, but these two different figures within the Old Testament that God chooses, the king or the Son of God to share in his acts, that then when you get into the New Testament, you have a similar kind of pattern going on. I think to fully answer the question, you would have to look in more detail at things like worship, right? Ways in which Jesus Christ was the recipient of worship. You would have to certainly look at other images beyond Messiah. Logos, obviously, would be another one. Places where Jesus shares the throne, although those are in some ways prepared for Davidic Messianic Old Testament texts. So I don't know if you can, I don't know if you can fully get there from the argument I'm making. I just think it's like one aspect of the story. So I hope that makes sense.
Maybe that's what you were trying to argue, that perhaps through this one trajectory we could get there. But and I've always been talking about how Jesus combines different images, and the combination itself was unique to Jesus's claim on his identity, especially the trial before the Sanhedrin in Mark chapter 14, where he's the Son of Man and the Son of God. And that's how we get a claim for Jesus' divine identity. So I thought you were going to be provocative and just make this giant claim, and then I don't
think like the origins of Christology. I don't think there will ever be sort of like an end-all be-all book that's written on it from a historical perspective that will fully explain. I mean, I keep saying the names Bacchum, Hurtado, and there are others, but any historical sort of like argument is going to have to be multifaceted in terms of its approach. And while we do have, I mean, I'll put it this way, like the Christ hymn in Colossians, right? Somehow you get from verse 13 of chapter 1, a Davidic image where he's the Son of God who has his own kingdom. He's in the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn, right? A lot of these are, as I argue in the book, messianic images. And then you move in verse 16 to, and he's the one through whom God created all things, right? Thrones, powers, and dominions. Somehow, right, Paul, the author, has basically moved from a messianic image to then making a pretty audacious claim that he's the pre-existent creator of all things. Anyway, so to basically to try to tell that story is going to require more than just the messianic identity and image, and is going to require not just exegesis, but also history, that'll be involved as well. Anyway,
But certainly, I think you're right in saying that, but it begins with Jesus' messianic claim. And then we can see how the New Testament writers take the sonship language and from that start to articulate position how Jesus is pre-existent wisdom co-creating with God.
Yeah.
And taking other images like that. So, but it begins with the sonship, and I think at least your book clearly, for me, made sense that that's exactly where our Christology should begin. I wanted to now open it up for questions to our group. Is there anything about your reading or anything that Professor Jipp shared that you would like to ask him of now? You can ask fun questions like, how has your book been received? Who is your hardest critic so far? You know, you can ask him about his adorable 3 kids, who I think are just, every time he posts things about them, I like reading about their creativity. His sons have their own podcast, among other things.
They've done
on classical literature,
yeah.
right? I think
my
favorite one was the episode when they were reviewing. Was it the Aeneid or the Odyssey? I was thinking,
it was the Odyssey. Yeah.
And how old are they?
They're 10 and 9, but my favorite was Lucas, who was only like 8 years old at that point, was like, well, Josiah, what can we learn from this? No, it was the Iliad. He's like, well, we can learn that it's a big problem when other men steal people's wives. Yeah, very true.
Yeah, there you go. So, but please feel free to, I'm opening up for a Q&A from our class.
I have another question, but I don't want to hog the spotlight, so I can wait if anybody else does.
Why don't you jump
I'll
in?
just ask.
Yeah.
Okay. So
First
kind
come,
of in
first
the
serve.
spirit of what can we learn from it, with your son's question there, I'm curious, how would you answer the so what question at the end of that Christology chapter? After reading that, like, so what in that you talked about the question that you began with, the idea of marshaling a strong theological argument, like for the the good of the church. Like, how would you answer that? How would you hope that chapter would fuel that particular so what question?
I suppose probably it's a great question, Amy. I think probably the where I'm marshaling it for like the so what comes in the next 2 chapters on sanctification, ecclesiology, politics. So to some extent, the so what would be sort of like, what does it mean to be a citizen under the reign of Christ? It gives us a lens for how we rethink power. What is the appropriate use of power? How do we relate to the political authorities as people that are subjects of Christ's kingdom, but are still waiting for the final revelation and ultimate restoration when he will make all things new? What does it mean, in terms of how we live with respect to basically embodying the same messianic character, And so I try to trace out what are the messianic attributes that are frequently associated with Jesus, mercy, forgiveness, peacemaking, attentiveness to the vulnerable, different, some of these sort of like messianic attributes that go throughout the New Testament that are a necessity for Christ's followers, or ways in which Christ, as the exalted and enthroned King who is still alive, still continues to relate to his people. He gives gifts, he speaks, he communicates through the Lord's Supper, he provides exhortations and warnings, So in some ways, I would say the chapter you read on Christology is probably, and the one before it you didn't read on Scripture, but are in some ways sort of like setting up some of the framework for the next, I don't know, is it 2 or 3 chapters that are trying to get there? So does that make sense in terms of at least hinting where I'm getting at? Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like you set up the type of kingship Jesus the Messiah it has established and is going to bring into full fruition, and then the implications of that pastorally are laid out in a political theology or
I guess
and politics. So that makes
I guess
sense,
to some extent, though, I would say sort of the framework of some of like the messianic elements of his identity. He's anointed and receives the Spirit, the life that he lives, the suffering, the death, the resurrection. all of those are really the building blocks of like what we share in and participate in as we're united to Christ. He doesn't receive the Spirit because he needs the Spirit, right? He receives the Spirit in order basically to preserve it to human nature so that we can share in it. And really, I would argue that with every aspect of the messianic life of Jesus, that basically his entire life is vicarious, as it establishes both what we share in as the basis of our saving identity, and also the character, the pattern of life that is to be our pattern of life as well. So I saw someone else. I thought,
yeah.
I
Another
had my
question.
hand up.
Yes, Michelle, please go ahead.
I have two. One is,
Could you please, I'm sorry, could you share who you are and where
oh
you are in
yeah,
the program?
my name is Michelle. I am a church planter up on the edge of the Twin Cities, just over the border in Wisconsin, and I have 15 credits left in my MDiv after this semester. So I have two questions. One is, I'm curious, I mean, I know you've done a lot of different fields of study, but what would be the most rewarding or fulfilling book or area of study that you've done thus far in your career? I loved your Faith and Hospitality book. It was one of the first ones I had to read for seminary when it very first came out. And then my second question is more particular to this conversation, but just kind of Tone teased at this. Tone's another classmate here before you came into the class. But just, you know, as pastors, how can we practically preach the significance of the conversation we're having here as those who live on this side of the New Testament? I mean, all of these things that you're holding out for us are sort of like, you know, assumed biases, things we're like, of course, duh, we have the whole book. But how do we help people, you know, appropriately understand, like, put yourself in the shoes of a monotheistic Jew and understand the significance of what we're trying to say about these identities of Jesus from a messianic perspective? Like, how do we do that in a practical way?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, so the first question is the most life-giving book that I myself have worked on,
or area of study, like project, or yeah, just what's been your favorite career highlight so far?
Okay, I'll answer that, and then I need a clarifying question on the second one. I would say probably the most rewarding has been working on probably the Saved by Faith and Hospitality book, and probably it's because New Testament studies, you're usually, you know, for the most part, expected to stay in your lane. Yeah, and I think, you know, Max mentioned my dissertation directors when I was working on my dissertation. He was like, you should be reading Henry Nouwen on this, and Christine Pohl, and you know, all these other, you know, authors that he's like, they're not going to be in your dissertation, you know, but he was like, they'll just make you existentially relate to it and think about, you know, and it was good advice. It was good advice, because then, you know, a few years later, I felt like, boy, hospitality is such an important framework for how I'm now making sense of my life and past experiences, and, you know, ways people have ministered to me, and relationships that I've had, and challenges that I see, you know, in our world. And I'm also like, and it's not just in the Malta episode in Acts 28, 1-10. It's like, you know, this is a lot of text on hospitality. So I think I was really excited about the opportunity to say, you know, I'm gonna do my exegesis and look in Bible land, but then I'm gonna like look in the world that we live in and ask questions about the world that we live in. And so for me, it was really fun to try to bring text and world together. I'm not obviously I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not a, you know, political theologian or whatever. So it was fun to read in those different areas and just try to not, you know, be arrogant or overstep my bounds, but, you know, try to say, okay, here's what some people have, you know, good research has been done on stigma, and on, you know, the role that prisons are having in our society. What you know, some of the theology of Luke Acts on hospitality have to say about that. So for me, that was really life-giving. I'm not sure I quite followed the second question. You're asking,
Yeah.
are you asking, and
Just
maybe
like,
it's, the monotheistic Jews part maybe threw me off a little bit. Are you talking?
Yeah, well, I can kind of maybe try to just simplify the question. Like, how do we practically bring the significance of all of these concepts to the average person in our pew? And I think specifically, like, I'm looking at a portion in the chapter we read from your book where you kind of just said, like, there's not an obvious straight line from Israel's royal ideology to our New Testament Christian Christology. So we all sit on this Christian Christology side and go, why is this an issue? Why are we having to ask so many questions?
Right.
And you're explaining that to us, and we're all nodding along saying, of course, yes. But the average person in our pew might be like, well, what difference does it make? And I think there is a difference practically. How could we hold that out in a helpful way?
Yeah, that's a really great question. You all are pushing me more on sort of like the practical aspect of this chapter. And so I'm sort of just thinking along with you as I'm, trying to respond to that. I don't know if everybody, every person in the pew would necessarily need to, be so familiar with that Christology chapter. Maybe what it could do, in some ways would be to say, like, the Trinity doesn't just come out of nowhere. Yeah, it's mysterious, but it's not just some sort of like esoteric, weird, I guess we're people that believe one God, three persons, whatever, but that actually, right, the Father and the Son, right, have a relationship with each other. The Father does things that the Son doesn't do, right? And the Son does things that the Father doesn't do, even though they're inseparable, right? Because they share in the same Godhead, right? The Father is this one that sends. The Father is the one that resurrects. The Son, right, is the one that loves the Father. I mean, they both love each other, of course, but obeys the Father, right? And carries out the mission of the Father. So there may, and I'm not keep putting the Spirit in here, but I obviously believe in the Spirit too, but maybe there'd be some ways in terms of saying, listen, even the Old Testament scriptures, right? We kind of see like a foreshadowing when God elects and chooses, right, David or Solomon or these kings, and he expects them to obey his law like the Deuteronomy 17 king is supposed to. And the king is supposed to lead them in faithfulness and love. But the king doesn't, except with a few glimpses of Josiah and Hezekiah and some of these kings, right? We're left longing for that Deuteronomy 17 king that loves God and delights to do his will, like David says in the psalmist. But when we get to the New Testament, wow, we see that in Matthew, there's someone that actually loves God, the Father, and knows what the Torah says and teaches it the right way and embodies it and lives it in obedience to. So I don't know if that's helpful, but maybe in some ways, it could allow us to, and I'm drawing on really the first section of the exegetical sections of the book, but basically to see the way in which Father, Son, Spirit relate to each other in ways that it's foreshadowed in the scriptures of Israel. So I'm not going to probably argue that this is, this is what you need, and the, number one priority in terms of, the person in the pews, just like they've got to get this, or, they're, or whatever. But there are elements of, Jesus' messianic ministry as the merciful shepherd or whatever, where I would say, like, boy, the more you understand that merciful messianic shepherd, anyway, the more that can speak in practical ways to the life of the church that might, anyway, call forth a better way of life in some of our churches. But I'm just gesturing towards different things I've said in some of the earlier exegetical chapters.
Yeah, that's helpful. I just think a lot of Christians today don't have an appreciation for how the Old Testament informs where we land with the Christology of Jesus. And they're like, yeah, what does it matter?
Yeah.
And I just think you present a really compelling glimpse into this does matter, and you should care about Jewish monotheism and how that landed us where we are today.
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, it keeps us from saying that the God of the Old Testament is different from Jesus. I mean, if Jesus shares the Godhead of God, he's the same God as the God of the Old Testament, two persons in one, and to pit them against each other I don't know, somehow Jesus softens our view of the Old Testament God might be something we can really challenge people in the pew about. Yeah,
Yeah.
among other
Yeah,
things.
obvious. Certainly the first, I don't know what it is, 300 pages. That's all mostly just working through the major, texts of the New Testament. The scriptures of Israel are everywhere. They're basically to interpret and explain the identity of Jesus' messiahship are obviously being invoked everywhere. I mean, that's really one of the few ways I know that Jesus' messianic identity is significant, is because when the New Testament authors are talking about it, they're invoking, right, all these massive messianic scriptures from the Old Testament. So, yeah.
I'm wondering if you could just comment briefly where it gets blended. Agency is actually not clear, because the Messiah is supposed to be executor of God's divine reign in Israel. So he represents Yahweh, but he's not Yahweh. And yet sometimes the Messiah does things that only Yahweh does. And so this is what Tom Wright says about in his book, Jesus and the Victory of God, that there's certain, let's say the eschatological David that is going to consummate God's kingdom, and all the nations of the world will gather in Jerusalem and worship Yahweh and repent of their polytheism, to put it in writing terms. So wondering, do you see that happening where, where places do you think that Jesus is acting out as the Messiah, but he seems to be also doing things that only God can do, that there is an intentional dual agency or blending of agency or ambiguity of agency that is theologically important, because do you see that happening at all? Maybe you don't. And
well, I think there are some places where, say, in the Gospel of Matthew, where he's receiving, worship, proskuneo, obeisance, right? And then in his resurrected and exalted state in the Great Commission is on a mountain as one who is sending people out, right? He's receiving worship there and sending them out. So it seems as though there is a way in which his messianic agency is connected then in like extreme ways to receiving worship and sending people out into mission. The text I mentioned before, Colossians 1, which sort of blends from Davidic, the messianic, the son of his love. He has his own kingdom. He's the firstborn, which is Psalm 89 kind of language, right? But then he is the agent. He's not the one that creates, but he's the one in whom and through whom and for whom God creates, and he's before all things. So a messianic image that sort of moves into claims about pre-existence as well as creation, or texts where he's sharing the same throne. So Revelation 5 on its own, I think, would be, everything's kind of leading me into Lion, tribe of Judah, exalted and throne. These are very Davidic messianic images, but then somehow he's sharing the throne of Yahweh, or there's two persons that are sharing one throne. These would be a few of the examples where it seems as though, they use the language of blended, where basically you move from messianic image to doing the sorts of things that only Yahweh does, or at least Yahweh now we see has fully shared. In the Old Testament, he's choosing different agents, he's electing them, he's giving them tasks, they're sharing in his glory, right? But they're not fully, exclusively identified with that. In the New Testament now, it's one person that we fully see who is anointed, elected by God, shares all of his glory. So, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Just want to open it up.
I'm wondering, Dr. Jipp, if you always knew that you wanted to teach.
Yeah, not
Brandon,
all.
did you introduce yourself a little bit too? Like where are you calling?
Brandy Sanders. I am in the southwest suburbs of Chicago. And my husband and I serve at Naperville Covenant Church.
All right, cool. Nice to meet you, Brandy. No, I did not always know I wanted to teach. I think I thought, okay, so you're in Naperville. So when I was like 16, probably like 13 through 18, I used to watch White Sox games on WGN, and I thought I will probably be like the next Ken Harrelson, if any of you know who Ken Harrelson was. All right. So even though I ended up moving to Minneapolis, and I'm a Twins fan now, and I'm trying to force myself to cheer for the White Sox. So for a long time, I thought it's probably be sports related. And then so long story short, was a Christian trying to take my faith seriously in a public high school where I didn't have any, like really no Christian friends at all. And went to a Christian college at Northwestern in the Twin Cities, and was kind of weirded out and surprised that there was like a Bible class you could take. And I was so amazed, and I ended up going there. I loved it. Loved all the, theology classes, and thought, okay, I'll probably be a pastor. I'll go into pastoral ministry. Was a youth pastor for a while. When I went to do my MDiv, I had an opportunity to, I found out a couple of things. First, I really just loved the academic side. And I also loved like the classroom. I had an opportunity to teach Greek, and really enjoyed the sort of like discipleship in the classroom where like students had to be there, right? And that was really fun. So it was probably there that I kind of started to make that shift, and in terms of realizing, hey, I love teaching, I love this, and I don't think I'm awful at it, and people are affirming. So that's kind of when that started. Yeah.
All right, great. One more question, last question of the night. Let Dr. Jipp go.
Oh, I'm kind of piggybacking off of Brandy here.
Okay, sure.
With the scholarship piece. So I really, it's kind of weird to say in front of actual scholars, but would love to be an OT scholar specifically someday. And so like, I'm actually in Greek with Prof Lee right now. And interested.
I'm changing your mind. You're saying I'm going to be a New
No,
Testament scholar.
no, you're not. Oh, no, I mean, I do love it. I thought you meant about taking Greek. I like it. But I'm just wondering, because listening to you and Professor Lee, Dr. Edwards, folks I respect, like just quote Greek or Hebrew or what, like, how long did you take language to be able, like, because I know it truly affects how you do your scholarly research and work and all that. And so what advice maybe do you have for any of us who would be hopefuls in that arena? Or even as, I think it'll make us better pastors too, or ministers in whatever context we're in. So
yeah, I would say that's a great question. I wish I could talk to you, for a long time about that, Tone. But I think at least, and everybody's story is different. So I'm always like hesitant to share a story and then think like that should ever be anyone else's story. I think the advice I would give, at least for languages, or you're sort of like, if you think, wow, that's really cool, like they know languages and they can quote it, or they remember this, or they remember that, would basically be, don't, how do I say this the right way? Like put as much hard work in as you can, like when you're in seminary or wherever it is that you're in school, and then just try in some small way to make it a consistent part of your life. It really is more about longevity than being like a language genius. I don't know if Max or Dennis Edwards are language geniuses. Maybe they are. I'm not. But basically, I've spent now like 21 years, sort of like making it a part of my life, like put in the hard work, and then it's read a little here, try not to look like a jerk, but maybe read it on your phone, as you're following along the pastor's sermon. Do 2 verses a day in your devotions. So whether it's academic ministry or pastoral ministry you end up going, you would go into, I would just say a lot of people think, oh, because it's hard, or because this word is difficult, or because I just read a verse and it just seemed, like I didn't get it. Psychologically, that's not fun psychologically, right? It's like swinging at every pitch and feeling like you're missing. But it's like the more you just keep swinging, right, the sooner you keep taking your shots, right, and the more you sort of build up muscle or eye contact and hand-eye coordination, that it starts to become a daily part of your life, and it's not so difficult. So there's really no magic bullet that I have, except to say, do what you can to put in the hard work, and then just don't beat yourself up when it remains difficult, and try to make it a consistent part of your life. So.
All right. Great. Can we give Professor Josh Jipp a hand? Thank you so much for gracing us with your time and sharing with us about your work and your life. So I'm glad that we had a chance to actually evoke from you your career path and how you got called to theological education. So
yeah, well,
I just want to again plug in that we read a chapter of Messianic theology, and it just came out in 2021. It's a great book, and I hope you have a chance to read all of it.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Max, and thank you all for reading it and engaging me. I hope, my wife used to work at North Park up until about 2 months ago, and I just live like 2 miles west of North Park, so maybe I'll get a chance to meet some of you at some point. So feel free.
We'll definitely have to get you back for something official.
All right.
And then,
wait, this wasn't official?
Yeah,
I just put it down on my CV.
Yeah, you can.
Guest invitation to Dr. Lee. Okay.
But
right.
we'll have to get back to you for like a part of our symposium, among other things. So,
yeah.
But thank
Cool.
you, Professor Jipp.
Thanks,
I
everyone.
really appreciate it. And then you and we're gonna get together because I owe you something. So breakfast, dinner, something. So it's an excuse for us to get together.
Yeah.
So
thank you very
much.
Korean fried chicken or something.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna go to Northwest Suburbs and we eat Korean food bonanza or something like that.
Let's go.
All
right.
That sounds amazing. We'll get Amber involved, and it'll be just Sue and I and you and Amber. How about that?
Yeah. Don't take Lucas. Too. He will eat up your budget real quick.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for staying engaged. So it's 9 o'clock. I'm at a little dilemma. I feel like if I end now, I get huge brownie points from the class. But we didn't really cover the Hebrews and the high priest Christology. It is covered in the reading, but not so much in lecture form. So what I might do is, and this is also for those who are listening to the recording, I think I have an older version of that section, and I might tack it on to this video. So if people want to listen to the high priest Christology, it's not that long. It's a short part, but nevertheless, I did want to talk about how while Jesus on earth was being crucified, another divine drama. This is the worldview of Hebrews. He says that while Jesus walking to the cross and being crucified, there's another divine drama happening in heaven where Jesus is not a prisoner of Rome, but he's the eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He's making a in the eternal temple, not the temple on earth. And so the death of Jesus coincides with a cosmic event that completely changes the fabric of reality. And so Jesus is the high priest who, in his humanity, sympathizes with our weaknesses and learns obedience through suffering. It's an image both of his humanity, but also his divinity, because he does something once and for all on the cross that changes the fabric of the universe. And our reality is never the same. So I'll try to tack that on to this video recording. So I invite you to come back and listen to it. Now, the unique contribution of Hebrews is that you don't find anywhere else in the New Testament. It's uniquely Hebrews. It's the idea that Jesus is the eternal high priest. according to the line of Melchizedek. Where did he get this from? Well, the same Psalm 10 that says Jesus the Son sits at God's right hand also says that he is a priest forever according to Melchizedek. So because Jesus himself quotes Psalm 110 to self-identify who he is, they're not going to just read what Jesus quotes. They're going to look at the whole psalm in which the quote is embedded. And the writer of Hebrews is going to think, what does it mean that Jesus has the eternal priesthood in the order of Melchizedek? And this is where Baucham's article is really nicely done. He recognizes that uniquely the Melchizedek language allows for two things: to describe how Jesus put on humanity, and to describe how Jesus is eternal and divine. Melchizedek does both. That's why it's important to the writer of Hebrews. Where does the eternal high priest make their sacrifice?
In the Holy Holies.
Oh, on earth? Okay, okay,
No, in the heavenly temple.
Yeah, in the heavenly temple. So I want people to see what it says here. Here we go. So look at what's happening here. Hebrews 9 says, now the first covenant had regulations of worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up, and in the first room there's a lampstand. He's talking about the earthly tabernacle, right? There's a lampstand, a table, consecrated bread, the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room called the Most Holy, where the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered Ark of the Covenant was. But all of this was an illustration. All of this is a facsimile. This is not the real deal. It was an illustration for the present time. And offerings were temporary, but they are not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They didn't provide a complete atonement for sin. So when Christ Jesus came as a high priest of good things that already are, he went through a greater and more perfect tabernacle that's not on earth in the city of Jerusalem that's man-made. That is to say, not a part of creation. He entered by means of he didn't enter by means of blood of goats and calves. He entered into the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. I'm going to talk about this, but the tabernacle on earth, the Jerusalem temple, is a facsimile of heaven. God's real throne is in heaven, not the Ark of the Covenant. Instead of gold-winged cherubim, in God's eternal throne in heaven, you have real angels, real cherubim, and while on earth you have partial glimpses of God's glory, in the heavenly tabernacle you get the real thing. When Jesus made his sacrifice as eternal high priest, he didn't do it down on the ground. He did it up in heaven. Spatially, metaphorically speaking, heaven's not up there, but you get what I'm saying. He did it up there in the heavenly area. He did it. So one of the divine images of Jesus as the high priest is that his sacrifice was made before the throne of God himself in his heavenly court, before real angels, not the golden angels of the covenant, before the mercy seat of God, or the throne of God, not the fake mercy seat on earth, in the Jerusalem temple. So
that relates to his divinity, you're saying?
well, let me give you an image. Okay. So here is the earthly temple.
Mm-hmm.
All right. According to Exodus, you have to make it a certain way. Color, length, very precise. Ark of the Covenant. Materials. 2 winged cherubim. At the top of the Ark of the Covenant represents the presence of God, but at the top, that's the mercy seat. That's where we sprinkle the blood once a year for the remission of sins for all of Israel. But all of it's symbolic. All of it doesn't last. It provides.
They have to keep doing it.
They have to keep doing it, and it helps renew the covenant, but it doesn't. It's not a once and for all answer. But Jesus in his divinity. In his humanity, Jesus heading for the cross. In his humanity, it looked like Rome won. They had a Jewish insurrectionist. They thought Jesus was a revolutionary. The charge for him was he was claimed to be a king rival to Caesar. The charges were illegitimate, but nevertheless, he was convicted, and he was going to die a criminal's political death. If he was just a normal criminal, he would have had his head chopped off or died with a sword. But this is crucifixion. That's a penal punishment to make an example that if there's anyone who dares rebel against Rome, this is what's going to happen to you. So from everything on earth, it looks like the forces of evil have won. But as he's heading toward Calvary, in Jesus' divine nature, he is in God's heavenly temple. And he is acting and he's robed in glory. And he's acting like a high priest. This is what we're happening here is two simultaneous realities, not two people, two natures. What's happening with Jesus' humanity on earth and what is happening in his divine nature in the heavenly dimension or realm. Heaven is not a place, it's a dimension. It's a state of reality. It's not bound by time, and yet it enters into time because of the reality of the incarnation, the resurrection, God, and even earlier than that, acting in human history. And so you have two simultaneous realities where on earth, it looks like Jesus is going to be assassinated, and in heaven, Jesus is approaching the Holy of Holies. So this heavenly temple is a facsimile of the real thing. If you look at every vision of the prophets, what do they see? They see God on his throne. Or they see, what does Isaiah see? He sees cherubim. And they're saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord. And Isaiah is stunned by what he sees. Everywhere in the Old Testament, you're getting glimpses. Ezekiel sees an eschatological temple. So if what is heaven like? It's an eschatological temple. That's the image, or that's Jewish cosmology for the entire Old Testament. God is in his throne. He has all his angels around him. He's sitting on the throne, the mercy seat, the judgment seat. It's both mercy and judgment on God's throne. And then the entire sanctuary is an act of worship. Resurrected saints, angels, creatures that are angelic, but they might have several wings and whatever. The 70 elders, they're all there. They're worshiping God outside of time and space. So Jesus, as he marches toward Calvary in his human nature, is marching toward the throne of thrones in his divine nature. On earth, he's going to be executed as a criminal. In heaven, he's going to make the perfect sacrifice as the eternal high priest, and that perfect sacrifice is himself. So let me put it this way. So the writer of Hebrews understands human history as from the beginning, God had always planned this. It's just that evil never knew about it. Evil had no clue how God was going to redeem humanity and reverse the effects of the fall. So my son, for example, he was captain of the chess team, my youngest one. He's out in college right now. And when he wanted to be, he was really good. So I did the whole chess dad thing. I mean, when he was like 8 or 9 years old, we would drive to tournaments and I'd sit there all day grading papers or whatever while he's playing his games. And in the beginning, I would play with him, and he was, I would kind of keep up. And then, but soon as he really got into it, I could never play. I was too boring for him. He would just stunk me like that. And I remember walking on a chessboard game and said, I was watching it, and it looked really entertaining. It looked like it was a really close game. And my son Jonathan came by and said, "Dad, he lost. Let's just go." And said, "What do you mean lost?" It's because in my novice way, I'm thinking, okay, I'm counting the pieces. He has 5 pieces. He has 5 pieces. So it looks pretty even to me. He said, "Dad, it's all about position. Look at the position of the board. As long as the other person doesn't make a mistake, this person's going to win." In 5 moves, he has checkmate. It's over. And so, because he knew how chess worked, he could see that. So 2,000 years ago, the devil thought, if I could assassinate the Son of God, I win. Yeah. He didn't know it was the losing move. Yeah. And the moment Jesus dies on earth in his humanity, in heaven, as a heavenly high priest, he makes a sacrifice once and for all. And God the Father turns to Satan and says, you lost. And there's no way you can recover. Game over. That was a losing move. It might be a matter of time before the chess game ends, but God's not going to make a mistake providentially. The crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is the turning point in human history. It's a done deal. God, the kingdom of God wins, and all of Satan's kingdoms get swallowed up in the process, and there's nothing Satan can do but be a sore loser. That's it. He has no recourse. That's what the writer of Hebrews wants to say. This is a once and for all event. In God's divinity, in Jesus' divinity. So on earth, it looks like the kingdom of God might have lost because the Son of God got assassinated, and all of his followers dispersed, and they're panicking. But we don't see what's happening behind the heavenly realm, what's happening behind the veil. Behind the veil of human history, God made Jesus the Son, the eternal priest, makes the eternal sacrifice in the eternal temple of God, and that is a done deal. And humanity's redemption is secured if we respond to the gospel of faith. And so this is a big thing. Now, and so this is a Christology that is unique to